Wrong! Conan, what is best in life?
To crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentation of their women.
That is good. That is good.
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes, and in my comments recently, people noticed that the DC Generation storyline wasn't in the DC Comics Solicitations in June. I thought I had somewhat covered this by stating that DC Comics are kind of retooling Generation 5, as they're calling it now, instead of 5G, and some of the other events leading up to it, which would include these Generation storylines. But apparently I didn't really talk about it enough, so today I'm going to talk about that, but I'm also going to wrap up some of the other short-term changes that we're seeing at DC Comics following Dan DiDio's departure. Just a few days ago, I brought on Dylan from The Real Comic Book Gamer, and we talked about Robert Venditti abruptly leaving Justice League for his dream project. My assumption is that is one of the first dominoes to fall after Dan DiDio's departure. Jim Lee and DC Comics moving Robert Venditti from Justice League onto another comic property that maybe needs saving, or they thought he would do a better job moving forward after DC Generation 5. Now we're also seeing that Generation 2 is no longer in the June solicitations. And also, Scott Snyder has gone on to social media to give an update on his death metal event, which is apparently getting bigger. So I'm going to cover an article about Generation 2 not being in the June solicitations from Newsarama. Then I'm going to cover an article about Scott Snyder's death metal event and some of the changes that go on with that. I'm going to provide just a few opinions after reading those articles, but then Perch from Comics by Perch is going to join me, and we're going to talk about the indications regarding short-term changes at DC Comics following Dan DiDio's departure, and kind of tie them all together and speculate kind of what they all mean and what we expect moving forward. First, I'm going to read the Generations article from Newsarama by their editor, Chris Aaron. DC's just released June 2020 Solicitations features a notable admission, the scheduled third installment in the publisher's Generation event, Generation 2, Age of the Metahuman. A month ago today, DC announced the 5-part event with a free Comic Book Day 0 issue of sorts. Generation 1, Age of Mysteries, was solicited for a May 27 release, and at that time, the publisher's press release announced 4 more prestige one-shots would follow monthly. Generation 2, Age of the Metahuman, Generation 3, Age of Crisis, Generation 4, Age of Rebirth, and Generation 5, Age of Tomorrow. There's no mention of the Age of Metahuman or the event in general anywhere in DC's June solicits. Since February 13, however, things at DC have changed. Dan DiDio is no longer a DC co-publisher, and Jim Lee has seemingly stepped up to be the sole publisher. Could the change at the top of DC's editorial hierarchy affect an event so imminent? Apparently so. So what does this mean for Generation and the story conceived by a brain trust of writers Brian Michael Bendis, Dan Jurgens, Andy Schmidt, Robert Venditti, and Joshua Williamson, and an all-star team of Doug Mahnke, Brian Hitch, Michael Yannon, Ivan Rice, David Marquez, and more? Readers will have to wait for more information. DC declined to comment for this story. Like I've mentioned a couple of times since Dan DiDio's firing, I have heard from reliable sources that DC Comics are retooling the Generation 5 event itself, plus the lead up to it, and these Generation stories were definitely a big part of that. In my opinion, this falls in line with what I've heard and what I've reported. I think these stories are being retooled, and they're definitely going to come out, prior to the DC Generation 5 event, which as far as I know is still scheduled to start around October of 2020. Now let's cover the CBR.com article from Collier Jennings about changes to Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo's Dark Knight's death metal event. Ever since Dan DiDio left his position as editor-in-chief of DC Comics, he wasn't actually the editor-in-chief, that's Bob Harris. He was actually the co-publisher, and I believe he was also the chief creative officer. But that title kind of got moved around a little bit too, so he might have just been the co-publisher when he was fired. Fans have wondered if there would be any seismic changes to the publisher's roster of books. According to Scott Snyder, there was, though not in the way one would think. Taking to Twitter, Snyder wrote that the editorial shakeup significantly increased the scale of his upcoming event series, Dark Knight's Death Metal. I know some folks were asking whether recent changes at DC affected DC death metal at all, Snyder wrote. The answer is yes, it's become bigger in all ways. Death Metal is a follow-up to Snyder and Capullo's 2017-2018 Dark Knight's Metal, and brings the events of Snyder's recently concluded Justice League run, as well as Year of the Villain, Hell Arisen together. The event will see the DC Universe overwhelmed with dark multiverse energy thanks to the Batman Who Laughs and the Infected introduced in Dark Knight's Metal. Wonder Woman and a handful of surviving heroes will be the only ones able to put a stop to the chaos. According to Scott Snyder, one of the other immediate impacts of Dan DiDio's departure from DC Comics is Dark Knight's death metal is getting bigger, and I think we can expect to get new information on that, within the weeks and months ahead, because this event is actually coming up in pretty short order. Now let's get to my conversation with Perch to talk about these changes. And with me today to continue talking about this subject is my good friend from Comics by Perch. What's up, Perch?
Not too much. Thanks for having me on. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I appreciate you joining me. I know a lot of people in my comments, recognize that Generation 1 wasn't in the June solicitations. I thought I had talked about how since Dan Didio's firing, DC 5G is being altered a little bit. They're rewriting the lead up to it, which would include Generation 1, 2, 3, and 4, as well as the Dark Knight or the Death Metal event. This was all expected, correct?
It was. I mean, we heard about this. We heard that there was some retooling. You're right. You talked about it on your channel. I talked about it on mine. I think that there were some public comments made of that 5G or G5 was not being canceled. That they were retooling it a little bit to lead up to it a little stronger and take advantage of the moments in time that were going to happen. So this is not new news, not shocking news, and certainly isn't a sign of impending disaster or anything like that.
Yeah, I think some people were like, oh, maybe it is canceled, but no, it's not canceled. They're retooling it because I think that DC is genuinely taking using 5G to go into it or launch itself in a new direction, following the event. Yeah.
I think a lot of it had to do with, and this is now pure speculation on my part, but the death metal event, I suspect that some of the end of that was editorially dictated or mandated by DiDio. I think with his removal, it gave him a chance to alter some of the trajectory of that event and how it was going to go. And so in turn, it changed how the lead up to G5 was supposed to work. So I think it's kind of a domino set of events. I don't think it's anything massive or major that's changed. It's purely a make all these events fit together a little nicer. And if you just run the math, actually, the G1, G2, those generation events, they weren't going to end at the right moment. And that was always a question actually a lot of retailers had of when they started in May, it didn't line up right with where we saw death metal was supposedly ending. And I think DC already had that problem as Scott Snyder's Justice League ended, and we have this gap between it and death metal. It clearly ends on a cliffhanger, but then we're going to wait 4 months to get to death metal. So there was a gap there, and I think DC's trying to avoid the same gap.
Speaking of Dark Knight's death metal, Scott Snyder went on social media and, there have been a lot of questions about his event. Has it been scaled down? Has it been changed since Dan Didio's exit from DC Comics? And he said, absolutely. It's gotten a lot bigger in every aspect. So I imagine that means, maybe the size of the event as far as the issues is bigger, the tie-ins are larger, and the scope and effects on the DC universe are bigger.
Yeah, I think that's a given. I think they're definitely going to do more than they had before, and I think again these are now speculation comments, but they are based on what we're reading and what we're seeing in catalogs and everything else. I do think there was a feeling like money was being left on the table. The Tales of the Dark Multiverse comics did really well in shops, and so I would not be surprised at all if death metal was adding to its tie-ins or doing a little bit more with its tie-ins. I do think that there was certainly a feeling that retailers were getting that death metal was almost being overshadowed by 5G, that it was going to be kind of the big event. And now somebody wakes up and says, hey, Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo make a lot of money. Let's make sure that event is right front and center. So let's not kind of overhype the event that comes after it. So I think a lot of these changes are happening, and I think it's resulting in what we're seeing here.
One of the interesting things that we learned along the way was that Scott Snyder was hesitant to add things that would lead into 5G into death metal, but it kind of sounds like he's taking a much more hands-on approach, or he's much more enthusiastic about things right now. What do you think the chances are that he actually starts incorporating some 5G elements in there because, death metal is going to have a bigger influence on that now?
No, I think he absolutely will. I think he's all but said that he is helping at least architect to some extent what's happening with 5G. He's certainly, his voice is being heard in the room. Now, I don't want to make a guess of how much or less his voice was heard before, but with this change, he's definitely one of the people that's helping to retool it and make it bigger. And so I think as a result, of course, he's going to then add more to his death metal event to make that handoff more seamless, which is frankly what any creator should do. Even Jonathan Hickman, when he talked about the House of X Powers of 10, one of the things he stated is when he leaves X-Men, when his run, whenever it ends, is over, he wants to make sure he's handing it off and setting up a nice toy box for other people to play in. He doesn't want to, force the thing that comes after him to struggle. And I think every good creator thinks that way. And so Scott Snyder, I'm sure with death metal, wants to help the company and wants to have this next step be good.
Also, this is going to be pure speculation, on both of our parts, but a few weeks back before the firing, Scott Snyder had said that, death metal was essentially going to be his last work on capes for a while, that he was going back to his roots and was going to do some, maybe some American Vampire type stuff, horror work and things of that nature that weren't necessarily superhero related. But he seems to be really rejuvenated. He seems to be much more focused on this event. If it's a huge hit, can you see him actually stepping away from capes at this point? It feels like there's a power vacuum that he might be, filling part of it.
Yeah, I can't imagine at this point he's going to step away. I can see him definitely taking a breather after this. And again, you're right. This is pure speculation. I've had no conversations with Snyder about this. And in fact, the public word continues to be he wants to go and focus on some of the creator-owned, wants to, the American Vampires, he said, do more with witches, Undiscovered Country, make sure that's going well. That's where he wants to be. Now, that said, being an architect for DC and death metal and everything he's doing, I have a really hard time believing that either he or DC, AT&T, Johns, whoever, will say, yeah, go ahead and do this stuff on a smaller scale. We don't mind. It's totally fine. You can just hang out over there. He's going to get brought into the fold. He's going to be asked to do some big things. He has to be, from a business perspective, from a comic book perspective. And also, I mean, he loves telling big, giant stories, and he tends to do it well. So we'll see where he goes. But again, my bet, pure speculation, he's absolutely not getting out of this mix.
It sure sounds like, from things that we're reading and in the way he's changed his tone, in social media and stuff, like maybe he's going to have a much bigger voice, as far as the creative direction of DC Comics in the future. Perch, thank you so much for joining me today. Just doing a real quick recap and addressing some of these issues regarding, Generation 1 DC. Well, it's not 5G, it's G5. It's
going to take a while.
Generation 5.
We have to change our minds around. It's going to take a while there, but and by the way, I think that in itself is an interesting indication. 5G was something coined largely by Bleeding Cool as part of their stories, and we didn't necessarily hear too much of it. But now the DC marketing is heavy G5, and I don't think that's necessarily unintentional.
Absolutely, yeah. 5G was a terrible idea. G5 sounds better, and I don't know. I'm excited, interested to see where this all goes, and I really appreciate the information and your perspective.
Yeah, thank you very much. Happy to be here.
If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. I would appreciate it very much. It helps us attract more views for the channel. Subscribe for future commentary, comic book news, and reviews. And don't forget to ring the bell for notifications. If you want to talk comics, movies, and much, much more, you can follow me on Twitter at Wes_from_TC. With that, Salamat Po, and I'm out.